Washington, D.C.
Tonight, diplomatic deadlines. President Trump says no talks are underway with Iran as the standoff over the Strait of Hormuz drags on. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Canada race toward a midnight tariff deadline with expectations for a last-minute deal running low. Plus, midterm test. Voters in Florida, Alaska, and Wyoming are heading to the polls today in some of the final major primaries before November. Among the races we're watching, Florida's crowded Republican contest to succeed Governor Ron DeSantis. We'll talk with New York Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis about what tonight's results could tell us about President Trump's hold on the GOP and the battle for control of Congress this fall. And warning signs. Long-term borrowing costs surge around the world as investors confront stubborn inflation, massive government spending, a flood of AI-related debt, and uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz. We'll speak with MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, about Washington's fiscal trajectory now with America's debt set to hit $40 trillion. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew, alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And Joe, we begin tonight with just 7 hours until fresh 50% tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Canadian goods take effect, with the Trump administration downplaying expectations for a last-minute deal to avert them, and the president repeatedly lashing out at Canada and its leadership in recent weeks.
Canada's nasty. They are. They're nasty. People, I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership. Canada's been very, very tough on us over the years, for many years, and no other president's done anything about it. To be honest with you, we don't need anything that Canada has. They need everything that we have.
Let's go now to Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who's live at the White House for more. So, Jeff, we're quickly approaching midnight. Does any last-minute deal seem to be in the offing?
We are quickly approaching midnight, and the answer, I think, to that, Kaylee, right now is no. I spoke to a White House official earlier today who also said probably unlikely to see any major developments on this tonight. And let's put this into context. I know we're accustomed to hearing the president sort of slag off Canada, but the Canadian-U.S. relationship has always been a very, very important one for this country. So I think it bears just noting that the president right now is putting that on tenterhooks with these additional tariffs, and that the Canadians are fighting back, essentially. And that is an interesting dynamic for what has been a more than decades-long partnership.
Latest on Iran, Jeff Mason, the president, on Truth Social this morning. This is all we have to go on. There are no talks or conversations going on or scheduled with the Islamic Republic of Iran. He also says the strait has been demined. Is this the first confirmation that we have that it was mined to begin with?
Well, let's fact check that last part. I think the president also indicated that it is wide open, and it is not. I spoke to a diplomat, a former diplomat earlier today, who called that statement in particular poppycock, in her words. And the evidence that she used for that was the fact that 2 ships have recently been fired upon. So the president obviously has a message he wants to get across with that. It is a contradictory one to the one that he and his advisors have been giving for a long time, which is that talks were continuing, even if they weren't seeing a whole lot of progress. But for certain on the bit about the strait itself, or at least some evidence to the contrary there, and the politics of it all, which you all know I love to talk about, is fascinating, because just as we're getting close to midnight in a longer but also shorter view of the calendar, we're also getting closer to those midterms. And the diplomat who I spoke to said Iran is very aware of the U.S.'s political calendar, and that could play into their timing and their next moves as well.
77 days to go. Jeff Mason, live from the White House. Thank you so much. As we turn to the primaries underway right now, happy primary day. Some key midterm races are taking shape as we speak in Alaska, Wyoming, and the big one, Florida. as Democrats face another identity test, with a group of DSA candidates squaring off in 3 separate Senate and House races. Joining us now for more on this, Nia-Malika Henderson, Bloomberg opinion columnist. Always great to have you at the table. Happy primary day.
Yes, indeed.
Let's start with the big one, Florida here. And the biggest race, I think we can argue, is this gubernatorial primary. Byron Donalds, who is no stranger to this program, appears set to become the first black nominee and could well become the first black governor of Florida. This is a big day for him, isn't it?
It is a big day.
Without the endorsement of the governor, by the way.
That's right. That's right. But he does have probably the most important one, which is the support of Donald Trump. You know, this is a race against MAGA, who is Byron Donalds, and then ultra MAGA, right, who is James Fishback, who's running against him, and who will likely lose. I think if in Byron Donalds, he's the odds-on favorite, obviously, to win the primary and then probably become, I think, what would be America's 4th elected black governor.
Incredible.
But in the meantime, you do see this sort of race against MAGA and ultra MAGA, with his opponent running against data centers, sort of running against foreign entanglement. So you start to see sort of the split there, where there is a part of MAGA that is disaffected, right, with what they're seeing out of this White House, with some of the cozying up to billionaires and cozying up to sort of AI tech guys. And so you see some of that coming. So a lot of kind of Florida observers in some ways see James Fishback as somebody who will lose, but in some ways kind of holds the keys to where MAGA might go after Donald Trump. So that's really fascinating to watch. Another thing to watch, I think, in this Florida race is just how enthusiastic Republicans are. You have seen a lot of enthusiasm from Democrats in these different states, Wisconsin and Michigan, record turnout. And let's see what kind of turnout Republicans get in Florida tonight.
Great.
Well, you mentioned the split in terms of MAGA and the Republican Party, but there's a split in the Democratic Party as well, exemplified by the fact that there's a couple, I think 3 Democratic socialists on the ballot. What else could we learn about the sustainability of that socialist movement?
You know, and we've seen some strengths, right, from Democratic socialists in these previous races. Some sort of Democratic socialist adjacent people, like Abdul El Sayed in Florida, have Democrats quite nervous, right? And it's the same thing with these races in Florida. If you are the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, you're looking at trying to flip the House. So you want moderates, right? You want people who can appeal to a broader swath of voters and not be so easily tagged as radical. So that'll be something to watch out of tonight in Florida as well.
Well, the clown car of candidates in what is currently Byron Donalds' district is wild. Greg Giroux's headline at Bloomberg Government was great. Ex-cons and carpetbaggers. I mean, several of these folks have run for office in other states.
Madison Call,
We'll be watching Mr. Cawthorn. But one of the lesser reported angles has been the impact of this redrawn map on incumbents, in some cases Democrats like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. What is she going to do in this district?
So this race, so she, you know, the saying, you know, sort of one of these things is not like the other, right? She is running against black candidates in this race that is for a predominantly black district. We know that what has happened with redistricting. If you're the CBC, you are not happy. The CBC Congressional Black Caucus has something like 61 members. They are facing maybe losses of, you know, 10 to 19 or something of their membership. And there is Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who has got a lot more money because she's been in office longer.
Former party leader.
Yeah, she's a former party leader, which is, it's it didn't end so well for her. And so now there's a lot of tension there with her trying to seek this seat, where CBC is like, listen, we're going to face such deficits and setbacks, and here she is running. I think she's probably, the favorite going in because of her name ID, and she's got a bigger war chest than the other folks in the race.
AIPAC money is another consideration here and in the Moskowitz race as well. Bloomberg Opinions, Nia-Malika Henderson, thank you so much, as always. And joining us now for more as we consider the midterms is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. We, of course, saw you last week on stage with President Trump on his trip to Long Island, in which he was touting a reduction in crime across the country. country. And I wonder, with the war with Iran still very much a question mark, higher gas prices putting an exclamation point on the affordability challenges in this country, if crime actually might be the best closing message for Republicans ahead of the midterms.
I think we need to remind the American people where we were just a couple of years ago. The reason why crime may not be front and center anymore is because of the work that President Donald Trump and the Republican Congress has done. I can tell you, in New York City, we had a FOIL request done, and we found that 16,000 crimes were committed by individuals who were residing at the migrant shelters in New York City that we were being forced to pay for as taxpayers. Remember, it cost us billions of dollars, and what all sorts of crimes are taking place. President Trump put an end to that. He secured the border with the Republican Congress. We were able to deport those criminals. We don't see that type of illegal activity. In contrast, what we do see is our governor, who wants to double down and continue to tie the hands of our NYPD from doing their job, wants literally zero cooperation with federal law enforcement to get criminals off our streets. And we see a parole board that she appointed that releases dozens of cop killers and hundreds of murderers and other violent offenders onto our streets. And so there is a contrast there in crime. I think it continues to be a big topic on the minds of the American people. But the progress we've made is because of the work we've done, just like, the tax cuts that we've delivered. I think that's another thing that we need to continue to talk about, remind people about the increase in the tax refund that they received this year, or that they've been paying less as a result this year because of the no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, the relief that we gave to those who work overtime, and the permanent tax cut across the board for income tax. And so I think that, again, it's about that contrast. And yes, we are working on affordability. We are seeing prescription drugs come down. In fact, there was a report the other day that said it's come down to the lowest prices in 60 years in terms of comparison year over year. So that is huge. That is a big thing that President Trump has accomplished by not just his negotiations with the pharmaceutical companies, but also the fact that he was able to get those companies to invest, to expand manufacturing capabilities here at home. That was one of my biggest issues. So we're not relying on communist China for our prescription drugs.
Right. Okay. Well, so let's keep this conversation going, Congresswoman, and it's good to have you join us in the midst of this August. The president's talking about capital gains as well. You mentioned the benefits of the big, beautiful bill that I know will be part of the story that you're telling on the campaign trail. What did you make of that headline last week? I know this was Larry Kudlow talking, but he says that the boss told him that indexing capital gains is something that he would like to see. Does the Ways and Means Committee have a conversation underway about this? Would you support it?
Well, I actually brought it up as well with the president when we were on Air Force One last week, flying to that rally in New York. I have legislation, as a matter of fact, that would increase the capital gains tax exemption for seniors who have held their homes for a long time. Right now, they're discouraged from selling their homes and downsizing. Yeah, right now they're discouraged from selling their homes and downsizing because they're getting hit with that capital gains tax, which is really taking a lot of that nest egg away from them. And so I think we need to address the capital gains tax exemption, increase that across the board. The last time it was adjusted was under President Bill Clinton in 1997. So it remains stagnant at $250,000, $500,000 if you're married. We want to increase that to $1 million. And, we can do it tailored for seniors, as my bill would do. But I do think, nonetheless, we need to index that original 1997 exemption to make sure it reflects today's numbers. My district, $750,000 is the average home sale price. And I'm a very middle-class community, cops, firefighters, teachers. We are civil service workers for the most part. And so this would go a long way in helping not just those in middle-class families, but the seniors who want to downsize, so it opens up housing stock for younger families.
Well, and understanding what the potential benefits of this could be to constituents in your district and perhaps beyond, is now really the time to be adding more tax cuts, reducing revenue even further, and when we're about to cross the $40 trillion mark ahead of schedule in terms of our national debt?
Look, I think that there is actually, if you do my piece of legislation, it actually wouldn't add a lot of money, because what we're talking about are homes that are in trusts. A lot of these seniors put their homes in trust, and then when they pass away, it gets transferred to their children, and there's no tax being paid at that point. And so we're just basically giving an incentive for seniors to sell their homes now, which is why I introduced this tailored version. But the other argument about increasing the capital gains tax exemption for everyone, first of all, you're going to create economic activity. You know, as people buy and sell homes, that's creating revenue in other ways. And that's number one. But also, I think at the end of the day, you're penalizing people for the inflationary decisions of the past, right? They're saying it costs roughly, it comes out to about a 51% tax when you incorporate the inflation over just the last few years of the Biden administration. That is really unfair to force middle-class homeowners to pay for that. So we should really modernize that schedule. It should have been indexed in 1997 when it was first done, but they didn't index it. You know, and that's the same problem we have with Social Security right now, where it is at $25,000 and $32,000 for married couples. Anything above that combined income, you're paying taxes on that, and that's hitting seniors who are really trying to just get by. So we've got to be realistic about, you know, how we protect middle class seniors and those hardworking people who shouldn't be the ones to be, you know, picking up the cost on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, Congresswoman Kayleigh mentioned that number. It jumps off the page, $40 trillion U.S. debt. We're apparently going to hit that number earlier than expected, driven in part by lost revenue from invalidated tariffs, according to the Washington Post. Does this suggest that Republicans have lost steam on the effort to lower our debt? Was DOGE a failure?
I think DOGE came in and it did find some savings, but we're talking about decades and decades of inflationary spending. I mean, it is really hard to just have DOGE come in for a couple of months and find you know, that type of savings. I think that we really
isn't
need
reconciliation
to get back.
all deficit spending? We're about to add more, aren't we?
Well, not necessarily. So, you know, reconciliation, by the way, the Congressional Budget Office is often very wrong when it comes to their assessments. And we could look at the 2017 tax cuts, for example, because I think it's a little too soon with this last reconciliation package. But 2017, we look at, in hindsight, it actually brought in a tremendous amount of revenue, much more than what the Congressional Budget Office had said it would. So I think that, you know, the best thing we could be doing right now is, yes, we got to rein in spending. We're doing what we can, but the problem is we cannot pass a budget because we don't get the 60 votes in the Senate. So we have to continue to do continuing resolution after continuing resolution instead of putting forward a new, you know, Trump Republican Congress budget that would reflect a lot of these savings and the savings that we would like to see, but also growing our GDP. And that is the whole point behind the reconciliation package that we passed, right? We're seeing manufacturing, we're seeing foreign investment, we're seeing private investment, trillions of dollars go into expanding facilities, manufacturing here in the United States. That's all big, and we're seeing the GDP grow. By the way, look at the numbers compared to 2017. The GDP has done well following the 2017 tax cuts. That's why we made them permanent, and we built on that success.
It's good to have you back, Congresswoman. And I look forward to seeing you when you're back in Washington. Nicole Malliotakis, Republican from New York, with us live on Bloomberg. Bloomberg, by the way, is mobilized on Martha's Vineyard right now, hosting its New Voices initiative with a live look on Bloomberg TV. And a great list of guests, including soon Rosalind Brewer, former CEO of Walgreens Boots Alliance. Be sure to tune in tomorrow on The Close on Bloomberg TV for her full interview. Coming up on Balance of Power, the Justice Department plans to deploy 1,000 poll monitors to election sites this fall, several in primary states tonight as Democrats sound alarms over the potential overreach. Kareem Crayton of the Brennan Center joins us next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The This is an ongoing duty and obligation. And by the way, it is no different than in Democrat administrations. In and out since the 1957, the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has sent monitors to election hotspots, polling places, to increase voter confidence, to troubleshoot problems. And we are doing that now. We just did it in the primary. We're going to do it to the tune of approximately 1,000 election monitors in the November election.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We spent time yesterday there with the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, speaking with us on the Trump administration's plans to send 1,000 election monitors to polling sites around the country. Got a lot of pickups today, a lot of headlines. Joining us now to dig deeper into this is Kareem Crayton, Vice President of the Brennan Center's Washington, D.C. office. Kareem, it's great to have you with us here on Bloomberg, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
This idea of 1,000 election monitors, I don't know what she means exactly by election hotspots, but is this going to bring security or intimidation to polling sites?
Well, I think you have to understand this move in light of the other things that this administration has done, which really has been to dismantle most of the tools and the agencies usually responsible for giving voters confidence. So with all of the work that they've done to try to undermine all the basic infrastructure, the sending of these troops seems to fit the pattern that really fits the opposite story.
Is that what we're calling monitors? These are troops?
Well, we don't know yet.
Okay.
And I think that's really the question. Yeah. To the extent that we see people who are armed and people who are making selections of places based not on where their issues, but where they think problematic voters are, that could be a real problem.
Well, the DOJ also is asking of a number of states for access to their voter rolls. They're suing over it, and the Assistant Attorney General told us that she's willing to take that fight all the way to the Supreme Court. What would happen if the DOJ were to get its hands on all of that voter data?
Well, that was one of the things that a lot of us in the civil society community thought was really a problem, and not just sort of from a particular political perspective across the board. There are concerns about privacy. We have a number of rules that forbid government agencies from taking on data that doesn't belong to them, particularly with respect to voting. So we don't know what is going to guide the decision to take on this information. And as I said, given what this administration in particular, that the Department of Justice has done to sort of ignore existing rules and guideposts, we should be very concerned about that.
We know that we're waiting for a ruling over the president's efforts to marginalize mail-in voting. We should note that he voted in this Florida primary yesterday by mail, as I believe his wife did as well. But we're already witnessing the impact of the court's ruling on the VRA. How do you see that on another primary day here?
Well, this is the other big concern about what the court is doing. We have a series of decisions that the court has made over the last really 10, 15 years under the Roberts Chief Justiceship that have really undermined settled understandings of the Voting Rights Act and its application. In this case, we've seen the court not do what it said, at least Justice Roberts said when he was confirmed, to call it balls and strikes. Instead, they've really intervened in unprecedented ways to move the needle, unfortunately, in one direction. And that's something more than calling balls and strikes, particularly at a very pivotal moment in the midterms, where a lot of people are mobilized in ways they haven't been before. The court seems to be putting more, I think, of an imprimatur on the notion of narrowing the opportunity to cast ballots and avoiding attention to race discrimination, which was the point of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, when we consider those who are casting ballots, this administration, especially in its push to pass the Save America Act, has talked about non-citizens voting in elections, which, of course, already is illegal. President Trump just posted on Truth Social some new data, he says, is from the Census Bureau. He said they began checking voter records from 2020 against their citizenship records. In the first 128 million voters, the Census Bureau proves that over 24,000 non-citizens voted illegally, noting that there's still 32 million records that remain to be analyzed. Have you seen any data that corroborates that statement?
I think the president has made up data that we've not seen, and I don't think the Census Bureau has ever crafted in earlier times. So I saw the clip involving the Assistant Attorney General saying this is the same thing that's happened in every other administration. That's exactly wrong. This is not the norm, and certainly not the work that anybody has shown in terms of evidence of non-citizens voting. To the extent that it happens, it's minuscule, and it's always caught.
We just had a big conversation about the primaries that are unfolding in Florida today, one of the states that chose to redraw its maps, the Republican leadership redrawing maps. You already weighed in on the impact of the VRA ruling. This is another way of seeing black majority districts impacted through redistricting in a world where Debbie Wasserman Schultz, an incumbent, is finding herself running and front running from what we understand in a majority black district in Florida. Is this a disservice to black voters?
Well, it's a disservice to our system. I think the point of what the Supreme Court has done is to really inject partisanship in ways that has never been the case before. And because of this Wild West system where everybody can redraw districts as much as they can, it has led to a lot of decision-making that I think most people are surprised by, including the district that you're talking about. But I think the important thing is to keep in mind that all of this didn't have to happen. It was only possible because the Supreme Court of the United States allowed it to.
Well, so when we consider then what else the court potentially could allow, obviously the president has asked them to weigh in on the mail-in voting. Do you see that there are potential avenues to intervene in the vote that they could open up further for the president, or do we reach a limit at some point?
Well, there are definitely laws that will forbid this kind of behavior. We don't know whether this president is going to test those laws. We saw several instances where things like birthright citizenship were challenged in the United States Supreme Court, and the court thankfully said, look, the law is still the law. We may see, as we saw with the court saying, look, we're not going to change in radical form the mail-in deadlines in this case Watson that came out of Mississippi, and the White House quickly said, well, we're going to do another round of executive orders. It will continue to be challenged in court. It is important to say that he's been challenged 20 times for some of these executive orders, and in 20 times so far he's lost. So we expect there to be more between now and the election, but there are definitely organizations like the ours that are out there working hard to assure that there's going to be effort to meet these arguments by the administration in court. And hopefully we will see the court do its job and say legally this isn't permitted.
All right, Kareem, thank you so much for joining us on Balance of Power from the Brennan Center. Kareem Crayton, we appreciate your time. And now we want to turn to power moves as we check on how the markets performed today. It was another down day on Wall Street, with stocks closing in the red for a third straight day, led by declines in chip makers. But the real story remains in the bond market, where long-term yields are hovering at multi-decade highs as concerns build over inflation and government spending. So let's bring in Bloomberg's Emily Grafeo for more. And Emily, we may have seen a little bit of that upward pressure coming out on yields today, but not much.
Yeah, that's right. We did see some of those losses being paired, at least in the end of the trading session. But when you zoom out, the story here really is that those long-term Treasury rates are at the highest levels since 2007. At one point, that 30-year yield hitting above 5.3%. Really what it's signaling is that bondholders are demanding they need more compensation to lend to the U.S. government for the long term. But it's not just a U.S. story. Kaylee, we're seeing this in France. We're seeing it in Germany, in the U.K., and in Japan. The story longer term is also that these bondholders are basically not confident that the Federal Reserve can rein in inflation. Inflation expectations do show up in the long term, and so do expectations about how bond traders are thinking about fiscal spending. So that's really the story for these longer term bond yields. Again, we did see a little bit of the trade paired today, but there's already implications for not only the corporate bond market, or not only the Treasury market, but the corporate bond market as well. We're seeing borrowers trying to issue in shorter term maturities. They don't want to lend for the longer term. They don't want to lock up, higher borrowing costs for a very long time. So in the private bond market, what I cover, we're seeing a record year for maturities, debt deals getting done 5 years or less. The idea really here is that companies are saying we think these rates are going to stay higher for longer.
It's a treat to have Bloomberg's Emily Grafeo with us on Balance of Power. Live from New York. Emily, thank you. Joining us now for more on the bond market rout and more specifically what is causing it is Nia-Malika, the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We've missed you, Maya. Welcome back. It's great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. $40 trillion. This is our reality. U.S. debt set to hit that number months earlier than expected, reports the Washington Post, as bond yields rise, driven in part by lost revenue from invalidated tariffs. You saw this coming. You're the one ringing the alarm of anyone in Washington, D.C. What's next? Raising the debt limit?
Well, I mean, anybody who's looking would see this coming, right? So this is not a surprise, the fact that we are borrowing more quickly. There is a fight for capital right now, both private sector and public government, and this is pushing up bond yields. And we know what that means when you have so much debt, $40 trillion. The fact that we are about to hit that when we hit $20 trillion in 2017, and suddenly here we are at $40 trillion, that means just small increases in interest rates lead to huge, huge additions to our interest payments. And so this is going to cause affordability challenges for American families, and it's going to create real debt challenges, interest payment challenges for the U.S. federal government. And it was obvious from anybody who's been watching these numbers that this is where we're headed.
Well, you talk about affordability challenges, Maya, and especially in a midterm election year, I wonder how you consider the politics of affordability versus that of the national debt. If there are suggestions to address affordability issues like having more government involvement in health care, in child care, are these things that necessarily have to be deficit funded? And do you have to make a choice between addressing affordability and starting to really get serious about the fiscal situation?
Yeah, that's kind of the circular trap that I think politicians are in right now. And we sort of just heard it with your previous guest, the congresswoman who was on when you were first talking about the $40 trillion. And then what were the responses? Oh, here's some tax cuts. Here's some more spending on Social Security. The suggestions are always things that would actually make the fiscal situation worse. So anyone who looks at the numbers knows we have a massive fiscal challenge, and people are much more concerned about it than they were a few months and certainly a few years ago. It is becoming very clear on a daily basis that this is going to have costs. But at the same time, American households are hurting, and they don't look forward to the kinds of solutions we need to actually talk about. We need more revenue. That means taxes will have to go up. And we need to find savings, and that means spending will have to go down. So there's a huge mismatch between what the political class will say in terms of, yes, this is a terrible problem, and the solutions that they're not really willing to talk about honestly. Very, very few of them are having that conversation. So when it comes to affordability, actually, one of the best things we could do to improve affordability in a structural and sustained way would be to bring our deficits down. So much of this upward pressure is coming from our fiscal borrowing, the fact that we are borrowing $2 trillion a year just to pay the bills. $1 trillion of that is going to interest payments. But politicians don't like to kind of level with the hard things that we have to do. And so they want to give more handouts, taxes, spending cuts, spending increases, and that makes the situation worse.
The numbers are just staggering. We talked to the Congresswoman about Reconciliation 3.0. She didn't want to allow for the likelihood that this would be deficit spending. That's tens of billions, about $90 billion. The president wants $1.5 trillion defense budget. But that's also not covered from what we understand. I guess we'll have to wait for the budget debate to get underway here, Maya. But what's going to get cut? What would have to be cut for this to be neutral?
Well, I mean, as you point out, the political discussion and what would have to happen is entirely different. We have had multiple reconciliation bills recently on taxes, on emergency spending, the proposed things now, where they have all been deficit enhancing. Reconciliation was a tool that was used to reduce deficits. Not so anymore. It has been a tool that has been used to ram through additional borrowing. And that's in all likelihood what will happen if we have further reconciliation cuts. What we need to do, first and foremost, we have got to get to fixing Social Security. 6 years until this program is insolvent. And there are across the board benefit cuts of 22%. So that's separate from the rest of the budget, but fixing it will take pressure off of the budget. We've got to do that. We should look at slowing the growth of benefits for people who don't depend on the program, raising the retirement age for younger workers, broadening the tax base and or lifting the tax cap. We know how to do it. Everyone in the policy community and frankly all the politicians know what we need to do. They're just unwilling to. Then there are lots of other areas in the budget we need to look at for savings. Healthcare, where there is so much inefficiency that we could really make changes that wouldn't have to increase costs for consumers, but our healthcare needs a massive overhaul. Same with defense procurement. So there are a lot of areas in which to start. We also have trillions and trillions of lost revenue just from tax breaks every year. It's just that it's not the handouts politicians love to give, the goodie bags, but there are plenty of ways to get the savings down to, let's say the fiscal goal most people want right now is to bring the deficit from 6% of GDP where it is to about 3% of GDP. We can get that done. It won't be easy, but it's doable without huge amounts of sacrifice. But as I've said here before, every year that we wait, the worse it gets. And at this point, the more the Treasury markets and other places are giving us warnings that time is not on our side and we shouldn't wait for an emergency to cause us to finally take action.
Well, how close are we to that potential emergency? Obviously, you do see the jitters in the bond market, but we still have, while we have been downgraded by the major rating agencies, the full faith and credit in the United States does appear by and large to be there. Is there a time at which that we do reach a breaking point where that very much is in question? And when would we cross that line?
You know, there's no one number, and the real reason is because so much of it depends on what's going on around the rest of the world. Where would people put their money, or kind of in search of the safe haven? And as we've seen, there are problems going on in many of the advanced economies right now. So much borrowing took place during COVID worldwide that we have fiscal challenges throughout the global economy. And that means there are fewer alternatives for people who are looking to diversify. But we know that lenders are nervous. They're demanding higher rates in return for their money. And we also know that the interest rates are likely to be higher than the growth rate. That's known as R versus G in the academic fiscal community. And that becomes a huge problem because you can start to have a debt spiral if you start to have your interest rates higher than your growth rate. That could happen in the next few years. We should not be pushing the limit up towards that. And one other point, because we're starting to issue a lot more of our debt short term, as you all were talking about, that means the turnover is greater every year. And as rates go up, we're even more vulnerable to our interest payments and the rates on those payments going up more quickly than we'd anticipated. Right now, just in the 10-year is about 55 basis points over what Congressional Budget Office had been projecting. That's going to lead to $2 trillion more in interest payments over 10 years. That just shows you that small increases in interest rates lead to huge increases in our tax bills.
We talk about affordability every day here, Maya, and I think some see the affordability issue and the debt issue at odds with each other, at least attempts to solve them. But aren't they directly linked? The higher the U.S. debt, the higher interest rates will be, the less affordable life is.
They are directly related. The single most important thing we could do to have affordability issues addressed in a sustainable way, not some quick fix or a short patch or like the sugar rush that we try to do with our economy all the time, but a real fix for affordability, meaning inflation and interest rates, is bring our deficits down. We need to find a way to do it where we phase in policies, giving people time to adjust, and they're spread through all the different parts of the budget. But you cannot borrow your way into a healthy economy. And that's what the markets are showing us right now.
Just quickly, Maya, we're out of time, but are Democrats looking like the more fiscally responsible party right now?
I can't say that anybody's looking like the fiscally responsible party, and campaigns don't bring out fiscal responsibility, but people are campaigning on giving things away. Used to be that Republicans wanted tax cuts and Democrats wanted spending increases. Not so anymore. Both parties want both of them now. People aren't willing to talk about, honestly, how we have to fix both Social Security and Medicare as quickly as possible because of their trust funds, and how we're going to have some form of higher revenue to get where we need to go. Everybody's looking for a free lunch, and I fear that that will still be the storyline no matter what happens in the midterm elections.
All right, Maya MacGuineas of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, thanks for always joining us.
Thank you.
And still ahead, it's primary day in Florida, Wyoming, and Alaska. We'll get into the key races to watch with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Thanks for joining us as we come to you live from Washington. President Trump saying on social media today the U.S. has no planned talks with Iran, as the 60-day deadline to find a broader peace deal expired without an agreement in place this week. And we talked today with Jake Sullivan, the former national security advisor to President Biden, about what options, if any, the current White House has.
Well, the best option is obviously not realistically available, which would be to go back in time and not start this war in the first place, because President Trump really has put the United States in a strategic cul-de-sac with no clear way out. And really, when it comes down to it, if you stare at it squarely, there are two bad options. One is to keep this war going with all of the costs to the global economy and all of the risks of escalation and further casualties. And the other is to cut a very, very bad deal. And really, Iran is just simply upping the price for that deal with each week that goes by, adding new demands to what it would require to open the Strait of Hormuz. And I think this is the horns of the dilemma that President Trump is locked on, is that to get Iran to actually step away from keeping the strait closed, which it largely is right now, despite what he says, the United States will have to pay a very steep price, I think, in terms of frozen assets, in terms of sanctions relief, and potentially in terms of something the president previously agreed to, a very large fund for the reconstruction of Iran. And at some point, the president, I think, is going to end up having to bite the bullet and do a bad deal.
Jake, it's great to have you with us on Bloomberg. I'm sure that you gamed out a lot of scenarios involving Iran in your time at the White House. Did the United States, did this administration underestimate this enemy?
There's no doubt about it. The notion that you would conduct a regime change war, you would kill the top leader in Iran, and Iran wouldn't react by throwing everything it had back at the United States, would have been debunked immediately by any serious person in the intelligence community. So the president should have known, and I think did know from his intelligence community, that Iran would look at closing the Strait of Hormuz, would look at hitting U.S. infrastructure across the Middle East, would look at attacking neighbors in the Persian Gulf. And Iran has done all of those things. And the minute the president decided that he was going to launch a war, the end goal of which was the removal of Iran's regime, which is existential for those leaders, they were going to respond in an existential way. And so I think it was not just predictable we would end up where we are, but it was predicted by a lot of people going back to the beginning of this conflict.
Well, of course, the president says it wasn't just about decapitation at the top of Iran's leadership. He says repeatedly, and still does to this day, that the goal is to have a denuclearized, non-nuclear Iran. And when you couple that with the president's statement on True Social today that no talks with Iran are ongoing or scheduled, can you reach that endgame on the nuclear program without negotiations on it?
There's no way. At the end of the day, the only path to verifiably blocking Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is a deal that includes intrusive inspections in Iran. That is something Iran would have to agree to. That requires diplomacy. It requires negotiations.
You can find our full conversation with Jake Sullivan on the terminal or online as we now assemble our political panel. Let's get into this with Democratic strategist Caitlin Legacki, senior fellow at Third Way, alongside Republican strategist Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group. Lester, I'm seeing the word quagmire everywhere. It was kind of a theme of our conversations today as we woke up to the Washington Post fronting the paper with a headline, including that word, as if it were a point of fact. Is that what we're in?
Well, it's been, I think, 6 months this conflict has gone. I think it's a little premature to call it a quagmire. I think it's fair to say this has probably lasted longer than the administration intended. I disagree with Jake on some of his key points there. I think there are some options for the administration. They're not politically super popular. The president's going to have to sell them. But keeping Iran from using its energy assets and blockading the Strait of Hormuz is not a bad medium and long-term play for the administration. If it can figure out the politics behind it and make this work for November, the president does have some options here with respect to Iran.
Well, on the quagmire, it's one thing to consider how long we have been in the conflict. It's another other to consider how far we may be from its ultimate ending. And I was struck by the latest Reuters Ipsos poll that found 80% of Americans expect that the U.S. will still be engaged in this conflict in Iran in the long term. And I wonder, Caitlin, if you think that may also be directly attributable to the fact that in that same poll, the president's approval is at a record low 33%.
Oh, I think they're absolutely related. I think the vast majority of Americans view this as a war of choice. They didn't view Iran as an imminent threat to our security. And the fact that the administration went in saying that this was going to be, a weekend at most, and now we're 6 months in, I think really underscores the effect of people believing that they don't have a plan here. And I think it compounds when you look at the effect it's had on gas prices, when you look at the effect it's had on affordability issues. I think when you talk to most voters, they're going to say that the president is focused on all the wrong things, and this is just a problem that for him keeps compounding.
Well, it's interesting. The conversation we had earlier with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, Kayleigh posed the question, and I'm not sure we got a complete answer to it. The affordability issue, this is a grind for Republicans. We're still above $4 a gallon. This might be the same or worse by the time we vote in November. So is crime the issue that Republicans run on for the next 2 months?
Great question. I think the affordability issue is probably the Democrats' best argument. There's no doubt, although I would point out that inflation is nowhere near as bad in this administration as it was in the Biden administration. The price of gas is going to be a thing, to be sure. The president's going to have to go out and explain how his Iran policy makes sense for Americans. Yeah. There's still a lot of questions about it. I don't think he's communicated it super well, but there's a very good case to be made, I think, for what he has done. Yes, Republicans will have to look to other issues. Crime may be one of them. I think the president will also have to find a way to find the silver lining on the immigration issue, which he kind of lost control of in the last year or so. He's got to get back to that, and border security, which is a popular thing. If he can define that as the immigration issue, I think he's in better shape.
Well, whether it's immigration and crime or affordability or data centers, they all seem to be at play in this midterm cycle, and certainly in the primaries. We've spoken on this network with Byron Donalds, who, of course, is running to be the next governor of Florida, about data center policy in particular. I don't know, Caitlin, if you presume that he's going to win that contest and ultimately be the next governor, if you feel that Mr. Jolly is a real potential challenger in a state like Florida. But what else will you be watching in the results from that state, especially with a redrawn congressional map now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've paid a lot of attention to the anti-establishment theme in Democratic primaries. And what I'm really curious to see is how much that translates to Republican primaries as well. Whether people are just fed up across the spectrum, or if that's more of a dynamic that's isolated to Democratic primaries. That's one thing I'm watching. And then, we obviously have a number of other primaries tonight that we'll be looking for similar trends.
Yeah. If Byron Donalds wins the primary tonight, will he be the governor? And if he is the next governor of Florida, the first black governor of Florida, will he run for president?
I don't know.
Okay. I'm coming in off the top rope with you on that.
Yeah, well, you are.
But this, according to many, is the future of MAGA.
Sure, and I think Byron Donalds is a great candidate. I think he's got a lot of attributes that Floridians like. I think he's got a very strong case for the general election for governor. Yeah. I think it's way premature to talk about if he's a presidential candidate. It's usually bad luck, I think.
Okay.
We start speculating about the next thing after if he hasn't won this thing. Mm-hmm. I'm watching his primary. If this Fishback character gets more than 3 or 4 or 5%, then I'd be a little bit worried about kind of where Republicans are on some of these extremism issues.
It's been an ugly primary.
Been very ugly, and
some of the allegations have been wild.
They have been wild. But that guy has a certain appeal among the disaffected youth. Yeah, Fishback. And so I'm kind of watching to see how well he does, if he surprises people with a number that's higher than the low single digits.
Well, and that kind of points to your question, Caitlin, as to whether or not you're seeing the split exclusively within the Democratic Party, or if this kind of crosses party lines on the split within the Democratic Party, though. There are 3 Democratic socialists on the ballot in Florida today. Is that going to tell us anything we haven't already learned in the results from Michigan or in New York, or is it just going to put on display what appears to be at least a certain faction of the Democratic Party moving to the left?
I think the one race that I'm watching it is the Debbie Wasserman-Schultz race. And I think it speaks to some of the socialist versus older black voter dynamics that we've seen in other primaries, specifically in Michigan. And I do think there is the risk of a major fissure within our party between younger college-educated voters who are socialists and older non-college voters who tend to be the traditional backbone. And they are increasingly at odds in a lot of these primaries. And I think when you look at the one thing that Republicans have to run on against Democrats this year that they didn't have before, it is this risk of socialism, this threat of extremism from a policy perspective that they're going to try to paint all Democrats with. And I think it's really important for either moderate Democrats or Democrats in swing seats to make sure they have a plan to push back on that, because it's clear that the American people don't like it.
You know how I'm surprised we're not hearing more talk about is Alex Vindman, the Senate primary in Florida. Perfect phone call. This was a household name at one point during the impeachment trial, and apparently might lose to Congresswoman Angie Nixon in this contest. Do you see that being the case?
I haven't been following Florida Senate at all, if that tells you anything.
Well, I guess that does tell you a lot. You can't take the money or the name, I guess, and guarantee victory here. This is Florida, though. A lot of these primaries are the general election, right?
Yeah, it's a very gerrymandered state, if you will, and it's increasingly red state, and the real actions in these primaries between the more mainstream candidates and the candidates more out on the fringe. Right. Fringe candidates have been doing well. There's a real anti-Washington feeling in this country right now. I will confess, I don't totally understand it. The economy is doing reasonably well. There are some issues. Interesting. But it seems like the antagonism towards Washington is a little bit higher than maybe it ought to be.
You're not watching Florida, but I would imagine you're watching the Alaska Senate race as a Democrat, potential pickup opportunity with Mary Peltola, former statewide, of course, Congresswoman, in the running against Dan Sullivan. We'll find out tonight which one. There's two of them on the ballot, Caitlin. But talk to us about the dynamics in that general election race.
So I grew up in Alaska, so I'm,
I didn't know that
I'm familiar. Alaska is really unique in that this is going to be their second or third cycle with a ranked choice voting dynamic. If you think that the anti-Washington sentiment is bad in the lower 48, it is extremely pronounced up in Alaska, and especially in rural Alaska where they rely on diesel, they rely on heavily on oil and gas, and they're paying $8 a gallon right now. Wow. And the affordability crisis, everything that we experience here in the lower 48 is almost always pronounced and much bigger up in Alaska because of how extreme it is. And so I think the anti-Washington sentiment is going to be strong.
All right, Caitlin Legacki and Lester Munson, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much for joining us. And as always, you can find out more about the primaries and everything else Washington in the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Now I want Caitlin's tour of Alaska. We'll see you back here tomorrow, only on Bloomberg.